So I myself, Simon Peter, along with the other 11 disciples, had been following Jesus for around about 2 years, 2.5 years. And we'd seen him do the most remarkable things. We'd seen him heal people, the lepers, the paralyzed, seen him cast out demons. We'd heard him teach the most remarkable teachings you could ever hear. We'd seen him calm the winds and the waves with the word of his mouth. And the one question that just plagued us over and over, that echoed through our minds continually, that kept us awake at night was, who is this man? Who is this Jesus of Nazareth? Well, little do we know it at the time, but in the events that I'm going to explain to you this morning, we were about to find out. Now, last week you will have heard that we as the disciples had been with Jesus in a region known as the Decapolis, the 10 cities. It was a Gentile region situated on the eastern side of the Sea of Galilee. And Jesus had been doing many remarkable things there, healing the sick, driving out demons. He had healed a man who had been deaf and mute. He was giving the most remarkable teachings you've ever heard. And over a period of 3 days, this massive crowd developed around Jesus. A crowd as far as the eye could see, 4,000 men alone, probably about 10,000 men, women, and children came to hear this Jesus preach and teach and heal and so on and so forth. And after the 3 days, Jesus called us as the disciples to him, and he said, I have compassion for these people. They've been with me 3 days now, and they have nothing to eat. If I send them away hungry, they may collapse on the way, because some of them have come a very long distance. Now, when I say that Jesus had compassion for this crowd, you need to understand, you and I'm sure we've all felt empathy, compassion for others in our lives. Maybe a loved one who is really sick. Your heart goes out to them and you feel such empathy, compassion for them. Take anything you've ever felt and multiply that by 100. And maybe you're somewhere near the compassion that Jesus had for people. For it was a divine compassion. It was as though his very inner being would ache for those who were in need, for those who were sick, in this case, for those who were hungry. And if there was one characteristic that Jesus displayed more than any other as a follower that I saw over the 3 years that I followed him, it was this characteristic of compassion. So Jesus says, I have compassion for these people. I don't want to send them away hungry. Where's the disciples say, but where in this remote place are we going to find enough food to feed them? We were in this remote place, you see. Now, it's not like in your day where you have apps like Checkers 6060, you see. And you just get on your app and within the hour you've got 1,000 loaves of bread and 500 fish and so on and so forth. It wasn't like that in our day. You're in a remote place. There's absolutely nothing you can do. So we say to Jesus, but I mean, where in this remote place are we going to find enough food? It hadn't been, by the way, but probably about a month or two since we had seen Jesus feed 5,000 men with 5 loaves of bread, but we as the disciples had very short memories. And as you'll see, our hearts were hardened and our eyes were blind as to who Jesus was. Jesus said to us, well, how many loaves do you have? Now, we managed to get 7 loaves of bread and we had a few small fish. But I thought to myself, I mean, how far is that going to go in a crowd of 10,000? Jesus said, okay, give me the loaves and the fish. And he took the loaves and he took the fish and he gave thanks to his Father in heaven as he always did for the food, and he broke it. And then we had these huge baskets there. And we filled the baskets with food, with the bread and the fish. And the 12 of us as the disciples, along with some other men that we trusted, we took the food to the crowd that were seated on the ground. And they started eating. They would take the bread and the fish from the baskets, and once the baskets were empty, we would go back to Jesus, and there was Jesus just breaking more bread and fish out of nothing, creating it from nothing, showing himself to be the creator God, that just as he had created this universe out of nothing, so he was creating the bread and fish that day out of absolutely nothing. And he would fill the baskets again, and we would take it back to the crowd, and they would all eat, and this went on and on, time and time and time again. until the entire crowd had all eaten and were satisfied. They were filled. It wasn't like a little starter that they had, where they just had enough, absolutely satisfied. They had as much as they wanted. There were some big men in that crowd that day. They had a lot to eat, trust me. Jesus was showing himself to be the provider, the abundant provider for the needs of his people. And afterwards, we as the disciples gathered up 7 basketfuls of leftover bread and fish. Now, you may turn around to me and you may say, but Peter, why did Jesus perform this miracle? I mean, as you've already told us, it was only about a month ago that he'd performed a very similar miracle where he'd fed 5,000 people with 5 loaves of bread and fish. Why did he do it again? Well, apart from the fact that he was showing himself, apart from the fact that he was simply fulfilling a need that arose that day and showing himself to be the creator God in the process, the all-powerful God, there's another reason. You see, when Jesus fed the 5,000 originally, it was a predominantly Jewish crowd that he fed that day. But on this particular day that I'm telling you about, we were in a Gentile region, as I've already said, called the Decapolis. And the crowd was filled with Gentiles. And Jesus was showing himself to be the God that cares for all people, that provides for Jews and Gentiles alike, that has compassion on all. Do you know how long it took us as the Jewish people to comprehend this? We thought God really only loved us. He only cared about us as the Jewish people. In fact, there was a deep hatred between us, between the Jews and the Gentiles. We didn't think God cared about the Gentiles. We saw them as nothing. And yet, over and over now, more and more, Jesus was beginning to show us, I'm the God of all. I have compassion for the needs of all people. I'm the bread of life for all the peoples of the earth. So after everyone had eaten and was satisfied, we as the disciples with Jesus got into a boat and we crossed over to the western side of the Sea of Galilee. We came to a region called Dalmanutha. And there some Pharisees showed up. The Pharisees, the good old Pharisees, always showing up at these opportune times. And they came to question Jesus, in fact, to test him. They wanted him to give them a sign from heaven. They wanted Jesus to literally do something like call fire down from heaven in front of their eyes, or make the mountain that we could see in front of us shake so that they would believe in him. Jesus sort of sighed deeply. He was frustrated. He said, why does this generation ask for a miraculous sign? I tell you the truth, no sign will be given it. Friends, the bottom line is that Jesus had done miracle after miracle after miracle. I mean, I was there that day when he had raised a dead man to life, a man who had been dead 4 days. He raised him to life. And when the Pharisees heard about it, they said, we can't deny that he's done a miraculous sign. But instead of them stopping and saying, who is this man? Could this be the one we've been waiting for? They hated him. They went out and they plotted how they might kill him because they were so jealous. They saw him as such a threat to their authority. The fact is, friends, is no matter what Jesus had done that day, even if he had called fire down from heaven, the Pharisees would have tried to come up with a way to explain it away. They should have believed in Jesus already from his teachings and from the miracles that he had been doing in front of their very eyes. And so to avoid further conflict with the Pharisees, Jesus and we as the disciples got into this boat again, and we crossed back over to the eastern side of the Sea of Galilee. There was a lot of going back and forth on the Sea of Galilee in those days. And as we approached the shore of the eastern side of the Sea of Galilee, we as the disciples realized that we had forgotten to take bread, except for one loaf that we had with us. Now, we were a little bit worried about this because it was our responsibility as the disciples to take bread, to take fish and bread, to have the staples, to always make sure there was enough for the journey, for the next part of the mission that lay ahead. Now we've neglected our duties. What's Jesus going to do when he finds out? We're a little bit worried about this. At that very moment, Jesus turns to us and says, be careful. Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod. Hearts began to pound fast. We thought he's on to us. He knows that we've forgotten to take the bread, you see, because he's mentioned the word yeast, the yeast of the Pharisees. Meanwhile, Jesus wasn't talking about bread at all. He was talking metaphorically. He was talking about the teachings of the Pharisees and this group known as the Herodians. Teachings like I've just told you about, always looking for miraculous signs from heaven, so on and so forth. Jesus said, be careful. These teachings, they're like yeast that works through dough. They can spread quickly and so on and so forth. Watch out for these teachings. We think, no, he's on to us. He realizes that we've forgotten to take the bread. So we begin to talk with each other about this in the boat. We're kind of whispering, oh, he said this because we forgot to take bread. You couldn't keep anything secret from Jesus, of course. He knew what we were talking about. And he says to us, why are you talking about having no bread? He was kind of shaking his head with a little bit of a smile on his face. Do you still not see or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes but fail to see and ears but fail to hear? He says, don't you remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000? How many basketfuls did you gather? We said 12. And he said, when I broke the 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up? And we said 7. He said, do you still not understand? Now, I can understand Jesus' frustration with us as the disciples. We've been following for 2 years, 2.5 years, miracle after miracle, sign after sign, always providing for us, always helping us. We've just seen him in the last 24 hours feed a crowd of 10,000 with 7 loaves, and here we are panicking because we've got no bread, as though Jesus can't help us, as though he can't provide for us. Our lack of trust was astounding. Our eyes were blind, and our hearts were hardened. And I can understand his frustration after everything that he had done for us. We just didn't get it. We just didn't get who he was. You may say to me, Peter, you disciples were dimwits. So slow to understand, so lacking in trust in Jesus. But my friends, I'm sure we all do this, don't we? We face difficulties in our lives. We face tough circumstances, and we take our eyes off Jesus and we look to the circumstance after everything he's done for us, that he's never let us down, that he's always provided for us. So don't be so hard on us as the disciples, okay? Anyway, we crossed over to the shore of the eastern side of the Sea of Galilee, and we came to this region called Bethsaida. Now, some people brought this blind man to Jesus. They begged Jesus just to touch him, just to put his hands on him. Now, the very fact that Jesus was willing to help this man is remarkable, shows you what type of a person Jesus was, because Bethsaida had actually been a town that Jesus had denounced previously. When Jesus had gone to Bethsaida, they had basically rejected him. They'd said, we don't want you here. Thank you very much. And he had said, woe to you, Bethsaida. But here was this man in need. Here was this man who came to Jesus with a need, and Jesus was willing to help this man. He was willing to show compassion on this individual. And Jesus took this man by the arm, and he kind of led him outside the village. And then I'm just going to ask Shane to come up, and I want to show you what happened that day. It's quite amazing what actually happened. So Jesus stood in front of the man, and then he spat in his... Jesus had some very interesting healing techniques, I want to tell you. But he spat into the man's eyes, and he said to the man, do you see anything? And the man said, yes, I see people walking around, but they look like trees. And then Jesus touched the man's eyes again, and the man's eyes were opened, and his vision was restored, and he saw everything clearly. You know, friends, as a disciple, in all the years that I followed Jesus, this was the only time I saw Jesus heal gradually. It wasn't instant. It was a little bit over time. And you know what he was doing? He was teaching us as the disciples a spiritual lesson. He was teaching us that so often spiritual truth is gradually perceived. You see, just like this blind man, his eyes at first, they were partially opened, and they kind of saw what was happening, people looking like trees. So we as the disciples at that time partially saw Jesus. We didn't truly understand who he was. We didn't see him clearly. But after Jesus touched the blind man a second time, his eyes were opened, and he saw everything clearly. And little did we know it as the disciples, but within a matter of hours, our spiritual eyes were about to be opened, and we would see Jesus more clearly than we'd ever seen him before. And this is how it actually unfolded. After Jesus healed the blind man in Bethsaida, we journeyed up right to the north of Israel, to the far north, to a region called Caesarea Philippi. It was called Caesarea Philippi. It was named after the ruler of that region, Philip, along with Caesar, the emperor of Rome, of course, hence Caesarea Philippi. And this region, this area, was a center of pagan worship. Everywhere you looked, shrines, idols, statues. There was a cave that had been dedicated to this Greek god called Pan. There was a temple that had been erected in honor of Caesar, where Caesar literally was worshipped as a god. And it was in the midst of this pagan worship where men were literally worshipped as gods there that Jesus asked us this question as the disciples. He asked us two questions, in fact. Firstly, he said, "Who do the people say that I am?" We replied, "Some say John the Baptist, and others Elijah, or one of the prophets." And then he asked us a second question. It was a question that he had waited 2 years to ask us as the disciples. He said, "But what about you? Who do you say that I am?" You know, this question, as I've already explained to you at the beginning, had plagued me for 2 years. I'd thought about the answer to this question over and over and over again. How would I respond if Jesus asked me? I knew he was more than a man. I knew that he was more than a prophet. Prophets don't heal everybody they touch. Prophets don't calm the winds and the waves with the word of their mouth. But I just couldn't quite put my finger on who he was. But at that moment, it's as though the Father from heaven revealed something to me. And the scales were removed from my eyes, just as the scales had been removed from that blind man's eyes that I told you about. And I responded on behalf of the disciples as the spokesman, as I so often did. And I said to Jesus, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." You know what I was saying? I was saying that Jesus is the Messiah, that he is the Christ, that he's the one that we as the Jews had been waiting for thousands of years, that he was the one that the prophets like Moses and Isaiah had spoken about, that he was the one who had come to rescue us as the Jewish people. He'd come to save us and redeem us. He is the anointed one. And then Jesus said something strange. He actually warned us. He said, "Don't tell anybody about who I am." We all thought, what? Jesus, we've just identified you as the Christ. You're the Messiah. Surely we should tell all of our fellow Jews who you are, that you've come to save us, you've come to redeem us as your people. But you see, what we didn't understand at the time is that though we had identified Jesus clearly who he was, we could not have been more wrong when it came to his mission and how he would accomplish his mission as the Messiah. You see, in the very next breath, Jesus began to speak to us about things that he'd never spoken to us before about. He began to teach us that the Son of Man, as he often referred to himself as, that he must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, chief priests, and teachers of the law, and then he must die, and 3 days later be raised to life. And he spoke plainly to us about these things. What? This makes no sense. And in a Jewish mindset, there's no category for a Messiah like this. Messiahs win through military conquest. They ride into Jerusalem on a chariot, with chariots and an army behind them, and they kill the Romans, and they kill the Roman emperor. And he gets set up as the ruler of the world, with us as the Jewish people following him and ruling with him. And the Messiahs are loved by the people. They're not rejected. This is impossible. Well, I just couldn't handle it, what he was saying. I took Jesus aside and I basically began to rebuke him. Can you believe it? I'm the gall of it. Me, Peter, rebuking the one I've just identified as the Christ. I said, no, Jesus, this can never happen to you. You're just obviously not thinking clearly at the moment. And Jesus turned to me and all of the disciples and he said, get behind me, Satan. You do not have in mind the things of God, but the things of men. Can you imagine how that crushed me? I've just gone from the highest moments of my life to the lowest moment of my life. I've gone from hero to zero within a matter of minutes. Now, of course, Jesus wasn't saying that I was Satan himself, but he was saying it's as though at that very moment, the words I was speaking was inspired by the evil one. It's inspired by Satan. You see, I didn't want Jesus to go the way of the cross. I didn't want him to go the way of suffering. I wanted him to do it my way. And I did it only because I loved him. I wanted him to have the easy way. But that's not the way that the Father had planned to accomplish redemption. And at that moment, I did not have in mind the things of God, but the things of men. And then Jesus began to explain to us as the disciples what it would mean to follow a Christ like him. See, we all thought we'd be the heroes, like I've already said. We'd rule and reign with Jesus. We'd be loved by everyone. And all of a sudden, Jesus said this. He said, if anyone would come after me, if anyone would be my disciple, he must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever wants to save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for me and the gospel will save it. He went on to say, what good is it if a man inherits the whole world and yet forfeits his soul? Or what can a man give in exchange for his soul? If anyone is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will be ashamed of him when he returns in his Father's glory with the holy angels. See what Jesus was saying? He was essentially saying that he sets before every human being on this earth two paths. There's the path of self, which says it's all about me. I'll live my life my way. I don't need you, Jesus. I don't need you in my life. Self-ambition, self-promotion. And in the process, that person can inherit the entire world, all the wealth of the world, and be loved and praised by men in the process. And at the end of his life, forfeit his very soul for all eternity and be separated from Christ, and Jesus being ashamed of that person when he returns in glory. That's the first path. Second path is the path of self-denial, taking up your cross and following Jesus. No to self, yes to Jesus. I believe in you, and I'm going to do it your way, Jesus. And in the process, be willing to lose everything, even your very own life. That's what would happen to us as the disciples. All of us, except Judas, would lay down our lives as followers of Jesus. Yet at the end of a life like that, inherit eternal life. Gain life, gain your soul for all eternity. And Jesus not being ashamed of you when he returns. Friends, what path are you on this morning? Who do you say that Jesus is?